On our second Sunday evenings of the month, we've been looking at some apologetics and defending the Christian faith. We're going to continue that this evening. In order to introduce our study, we need to begin with an understanding of a couple of important ideas. The first has to do with the concept of materialism. This is the philosophy that suggests that everything exists is of a material nature. That is, it is purely physical. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the word materialism refers to the theory or belief that nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications. And let me mention at the beginning, I don't normally like to include long quotations in my PowerPoints, especially if I'm going to read them, but I want everyone to see for themselves the words that we're going to be looking at. So a materialist is a person who asserts that only physical things exist and that everything follows the fixed laws of nature. Of course, this belief is one that rejects anything supernatural, anything that does not have a physical makeup. And of course, that belief then, by definition, rejects the idea of a supreme being or any spiritual reality whatsoever. It denies anything that is beyond the physical and the laws of nature. The second idea is how modern science operates, or at least should operate. Most scientists claim to look at what is observable in nature and what is reproducible in order to understand how the natural world operates. And so they will appeal to the scientific method to come to conclusions about how the world works. And you've probably heard about the scientific method and its importance in many areas of study. According to Gavin Wright, the scientific method is the process of objectively establishing facts through testing and experimentation. The basic process involves making an observation, forming a hypothesis, making a prediction, conducting an experiment, and finally analyzing the results. In this definition, notice two essential elements in the scientific method. One is observation, and the other is experimentation. We'll be keying in on those two. Because of those two essential elements, those who reject a supreme being, God's creation of the universe, and the inspiration of the Bible point to these two elements in their efforts to discount the teaching of God's Word. For example, a National Center for Biotechnical Information website says, the arguments of creationists are not driven by evidence that can be observed in the natural world. Special creation or supernatural intervention is not subjectable to meaningful tests, which require predicting plausible results and then checking these results through observation and experimentation. Notice two elements of the scientific method are used to suggest that what the Christian believes is not valid because they're not based on evidence that can be observed in the natural world, and they are not subjectable to meaningful tests. Please keep those two things in mind as we continue. We'll come back to that. Because the claim is made that what the creationists believe is unscientific because they can't be observed and they can't be tested. These are important because we want to consider tonight a materialistic miracle. Of course, because of what we've just noticed, you should recognize that this title is self-contradictory. There is no room in the materialistic philosophy for events that are contrary to what we find in nature, according to natural laws. There's nothing above natural laws. They cannot both be true. You can't have a miracle if materialism is correct. But as we'll see, that's exactly what many people accept today. With that in mind, consider the question of how life came into existence on the earth. And as we think about this, there are only two possibilities for the origin of life. Either life came about by natural or supernatural means. There are no other options. There are no other alternatives. These are the only two. Either life came through a miracle by supernatural power, or it came about through normal processes in harmony with natural laws. Which one is correct? Let's first look at how the so-called scientists explain the origin of life. That is, life through natural means exclusively. According to modern textbooks, scientific articles, and similar sources, life came about through what is called abiogenesis. Long word. Of course, if we're talking scientific words, we have to have long words, right? Abiogenesis is a combination term that basically means not, life, and beginning. It's the concept of non-biological origins. The definition of abiogenesis is the origin of life from non-living matter. It is the theory that life can arise spontaneously from non-life molecules under proper conditions. I believe more accurately, as the Collaborative International Dictionary says, it is the supposed origination of living organisms from lifeless matter, such genesis as does not involve the action of living parents. There's another term that's very similar, which is called spontaneous generation, that is often given as a synonym for abiogenesis. However, many scientists are trying to move away from spontaneous generation, and so some sources make a distinction between the two. For example, one writer suggests that abiogenesis theorizes that primitive life, separate replicating RNA, protein molecules, etc., originated from non-living matter, while spontaneous generation theorizes on the generation of complex life, mice and maggots, etc., from non-living matter. However, the Oxford Dictionary defines spontaneous generation as the supposed production of living organisms from non-living matter, and that exactly matches the definition of abiogenesis. Let's think about this using an analogy. Imagine you have a metal can that is completely sealed, and you've removed everything from the can. It is absolutely empty, including the air from the can. So you have a vacuum inside the can. You have sealed the can. There is absolutely nothing in that can. And you leave this can sitting on the ground for 3 days. And after 3 days, you open up the can. And you can probably tell me what would be in the can. Nothing. Well, what if I left that can instead of for 3 days, for 3 years, and then opened it? Well, there would still be nothing. Yes, but what if I left it for 3 million years and then opened the empty can? There would still be nothing in the can. We understand the length of time doesn't matter. Regardless of how long you leave that empty can, that wouldn't change the fact that it's going to remain empty. Since there's nothing in the can, there's nothing to change that situation and make something suddenly appear inside. And that includes life. Yet the story is told straight-faced, as if it actually happened. Consider this quotation. In the beginning, there were simple chemicals, and they produced amino acids that eventually became the proteins necessary to create single cells, and the single cells became plants and animals. Isn't that a marvelous explanation? The incredible jump from chemicals to creatures is made in passing. They just produced and became something else. But in the story, there has to be a transition that caused these non-living chemicals to become living creatures. What is assumed is that abiogenesis took place. The major problem is there is absolutely no evidence that abiogenesis can or ever did really happen. No one in the history of mankind has ever observed life springing from non-life. It has not been observed even once. As Stuart Clark admits, there are no recorded instances of an origin of life event on modern Earth. Some people are honest enough to admit the enormous problems with abiogenesis, and this includes how it could even happen. For example, Harvard chemist George Whitesides, who was given the Priestley Medal, the highest award of the American Chemical Society, says, the origin of life. This problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life and us in the universe. Most chemists believe, as I do, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic earth. How? I have no idea. Greg Easterbrook writes, what creates life out of the inanimate compounds that make up living things? No one knows. How were the first organisms assembled? Nature hasn't given us the slightest hint. If anything, the mystery has deepened over time. Now let me say, this ignorance about how life came into being isn't from a lack of trying. Materialists have been trying every conceivable way to come up with a way for abiogenesis to occur. But you know as well as I do that common sense tells us the probability of life just springing into existence on its own is zero. Michael Denton makes this admission. The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. Notice that last phrase. We wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Remember earlier we mentioned the two vital elements in the scientific method. And these are the ones used to suggest that what Christians believe is not valid because they're not based on evidence that can be observed in the natural world. And number two, not subjectable to meaningful tests. May I suggest that if this is the basis for rejecting the work of God in creation, then it is also the basis for rejecting the idea of abiogenesis. There is no evidence that biogenesis can occur, that it ever did occur, and it has never been observed in the natural world, not once. In addition, it's not able to be tested even once, much less be repeated, which science demands. Why then hasn't the scientific community completely rejected this idea? That's what the scientific method would lead us to. Why do they still believe in a materialistic miracle? The answer is perfectly clear. They're not willing to accept the only other alternative, which demands the existence of a God as the uncaused creator. Consider this interesting quote. Once we see, however, that the probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule as to make the random concept absurd, it becomes sensible to think that the favorable properties of physics on which life depends are in every respect deliberate. It is therefore almost inevitable that our own measure of intelligence must reflect in a valid way the higher intelligences, even to the extreme idealized limit of God. While the divine explanation is rejected, it's not because of the overwhelming evidence for abiogenesis. There is none. The eminent George Wald, though believing in evolution, nevertheless admits One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. It's impossible, but I still believe it. That's a materialistic miracle. That's certainly telling. It's illogical to believe in a materialistic miracle. It's amazing to consider that a belief in abiogenesis is equal to admitting that brilliant scientists, with all of the modern instrumentation, the latest equipment, the latest technology, cannot do what non-intelligent matter supposedly did accidentally. Perhaps you've heard the name Robert Jastrow, the late Robert Jastrow. Dr. Jastrow was a PhD in physics, an assistant professor at Yale. He was the head of the theoretical division at NASA, and the list goes on and on. Listen to what he writes. Perhaps the appearance of life on Earth is a miracle. Scientists are reluctant to accept that view, but their choices are limited. Either life was created on Earth by the will of a being outside the grasp of scientific understanding, or it evolved on our planet spontaneously through chemical reactions occurring in non-living matter lying on the surface of the planet. The first theory places the question of the origin of life beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. It is a statement of faith in the power of a supreme being, not subject to the laws of science. The second theory is also an act of faith. The act of faith consists in assuming that the scientific view of the origin of life is correct without having concrete evidence to support that belief. Here's a very learned man, and he says there are these two options. Both have to be taken on faith, including abiogenesis, because there is no evidence to support that belief. That admission is certainly revealing. Jastrow is essentially saying that both views involve an event that is outside the normal. Both demand that a miracle took place. The only question is, to whom do you ascribe the miracle? Non-living matter creating itself, or an almighty God performing that miracle? A review of literature that discusses the origin of life on Earth reveals that content often fails to address the crucial issue, which is the actual point at which life came into being. This is very far different than talking about the building blocks of life. Even if scientific endeavors are able to artificially create amino acids, sugars, nucleotides, RNA, fatty acids, and the other building blocks of life, that doesn't begin to touch the real issue. The real issue is how life itself began, not how the physical precursors of life came into being. Impressive headlines such as "The Secret of How Life on Earth Began" that appeared on the BBC Earth website October 31st, 2016, was followed by a discussion of how scientists can manipulate non-living materials. That's not evidence of biogenesis. Consider this quotation by Michael Irving. "The study of life's beginning, or abiogenesis, has been ongoing for the better part of a century. And there are several theories for how non-living molecules first gave rise to living cells. Perhaps the best known is the idea of primordial soup, which suggests when sources of energy such as lightning or sunlight interacted with the Earth's early atmosphere, organic compounds would have formed and interacted with each other. These eventually gave rise to amino acids, the building blocks of life, and in turn, simple life forms. Notice how the author jumps, as they often do, from the building blocks of life to simply life forms, with no effort to explain that jump. They just gave rise to something else. It just happened in turn, but that is the very jump of explanation that abiogenesis demands. We can't simply pass over it. The best known theory of how non-living molecules gave rise cannot be an unexplained jump. Or as I like to say it, saying poof isn't proof. And as we illustrated with our can, just giving it millions of years doesn't help the situation. Time doesn't have any creative ability. Non-living matter doesn't suddenly become alive because we allowed more time to pass. And this is an important consideration also. Even if scientists were able to demonstrate that they could create every single one of the material elements necessary, and then put all of those elements together to create a physical body, that doesn't mean they can cause that body to come alive. A collection of non-living materials is still not alive. The body of a person who has just died obviously has all the necessary building blocks, the physical elements for life, but it lacks that remarkable spark or germ that makes it living. James 2:26 says, without the Spirit, the body is dead. And there's a reason we call it a corpse instead of a body. Some people make the claim that the origin of life isn't part of the idea of evolution. Evolution, it is claimed, deals only with the changes in life that already exist, not the ultimate origin. Even Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, says nothing about the origin of species. The fact remains that evolution must logically have a beginning. It should be obvious to everyone that life must have started at some point in time, somewhere, somehow. In discussing the question of how something could come from nothing, Wayne Jackson observes this. Some attempt to avoid this question by suggesting that it is not germane, that is not relevant to the evolutionary issue. For evolution deals with development, not origin. And then he notes there has to be origin before there can be development. The question is entirely germane, and Darwinists simply cannot deal with it. That's absolutely right. Evolutionists can't skirt this enormous problem. In fact, it's in the definition. Merriam-Webster's definition of the noun abiogenesis says specifically, it is a theory in the evolution of early life on Earth. Organic molecules and subsequent life forms first originated from inorganic substances. Wikipedia says, in evolutionary biology, abiogenesis, or informally the origin of life, is the natural process by which life has arisen from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds. The attempted sidestepping, claiming that, well, this is not part of evolution, is completely wrong. They cannot be separated. And so the theory of evolution tries to explain the origin of various species through natural processes while denying the work of a supernatural being. But if a person rules out the supernatural, then that person must assume that the initial creation of life also took place through natural means. And so Jeff Miller notes, abiogenesis is required by evolution as the starting point. Evolution is an attempt to explain life through natural means, and abiogenesis must go hand in hand with such a theory. Back in 1959, Hans Gaffron stated, a natural scientist who wants to study the evolutionary process has no choice but to start and proceed from the assumption that the living came from the non-living. This in spite of the fact that what stares him in the eye, all life about him is so fantastically complex that it is hard for him to believe it truly happened. What's he saying? He's saying all of the evidence points the other way, but we have to assume abiogenesis, despite all of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And by the way, that has not changed since 1959. Evolutionists can't have it both ways. They can't assume that unnatural events can take place, including abiogenesis, events that do not occur in nature, yet at the same time illogically reject the possibility of unnatural events that come from a supernatural source, namely God. L. Maston on the website Physics of the Universe writes, what are the origins of life on Earth? How did things go from non-living to living, from something that could not reproduce to something that could? How can a collection of inanimate atoms become animate? How did organic molecules achieve a high enough level of complexity to be considered as living? The short answer is, we do not really know how life originated on this planet. Now, what a sad statement that is. This ignorance comes from the fact that those who accept abiogenesis cannot be consistent, and they cannot believe in a materialistic miracle, but they're forced to do so. The impossibility of life arising from non-life leaves only one other alternative, that it came from a supernatural source. When we look at the scriptures, we find God has revealed to us how life began. We have the answer. We know how life originated on the earth from the mouth of the very one who did it. Nehemiah 9:6 says, you are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. How did life arise in the animal kingdom? God created it. He also miraculously created life in the human race. Genesis 2 verse 7 reveals that the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. We don't have to be ignorant about how life began. We don't have to, as the scientists say, I have no idea. We have the truth. That ignorance only comes from a rejection of the scriptures and the clear teaching of what God has revealed. But you know, everyone knows the hard evidence. Everyone. David Dimmock observes thousands of experiments and all of the recently gained knowledge of molecular biology and genetics have only served to strengthen the most fundamental law of biology. All cells come from other cells, also known as the law of biogenesis. That's the law. That's what the evidence shows all around us. Just take abiogenesis and take the A out, and you have life all around us. The law of biogenesis, a law for which there are no known exceptions. That's why it's a law. The fact is that everyone can recognize that all life comes from pre-existing life. We all know that. That has been observed by mankind throughout all of history. And it's the only thing we observe in the natural world today. Only a biased mind is compelled to propose something different, especially when there's not a shred of evidence for what they're saying. The law of biogenesis is exactly what the record of Genesis affirms. The Bible teaches that life comes from previous life and that after its kind. We're not here as the result of a miraculous biological accident. We are here as the result of the purposeful creative work of Almighty God, with whom is the divine fountain of life, Psalm 36, verse 9. And an examination of the evidence points inescapably to this conclusion. Do scientists generally believe in miracles? No, and especially not the miracles recorded in the Scriptures. But they do believe in one miracle, and it's called abiogenesis. But this belief is not based on observation. It has never been observed, ever. The only time it allegedly took place was in the past, which could not be observed. Furthermore, because it's asserted to have occurred in the past, it cannot be tested. You can only conduct experiments and tests in the present. And no test has ever demonstrated that life from non-life is possible. But even if that could be done, that they could create life in a test tube, as they have claimed before, it would say nothing about how life came in the first place. In addition, there's no conceivable means by which this transition could ever happen. There's no possible mechanism by which you can get life from non-life. The very concept of abiogenesis is unreasonable, unscientific, and unsupported by the evidence. May I suggest to you that those who believe in evolution are usually comfortable talking about many aspects of that theory. But when we discuss how the human race came into being, let me suggest that we demand of them that they explain how life came into being. You see, it's easy to get caught up in the details of issues such as the process by which fossils form or the assumptions behind radiometric dating and those types of things, and it can lead to an unproductive discussion. But everyone knows how life comes about. We know from common sense, we know from observation every day. We know that life comes from previous life. It doesn't make sense to assert that life came from the non-living. And so ask them for the evidence for abiogenesis. Where are the observations that demonstrate it? What are the experiments that they have done to make it happen? There are none. And if they're honest, they have to admit that there are none. What science demands, they cannot provide. And so don't get lost in all of the details and the minutiae of all the things of the theory. Go with this simple thing. They will recognize the scientific method and they will use it against you as a Christian to say, where are your observations? Where are your experiments? Ask them the same question about the origin of life. We must hold them to the same standard to which they hold us. If they claim that our Christian belief should be rejected because as they view it, there's a lack of observation and testability, then so should theirs. They cannot rationally explain their belief in a materialistic miracle. There is no such thing. On the other hand, the Bible is 100% accurate. What it records is completely trustworthy, including the divine explanation about how life came to this planet. And we see the process set up in Genesis every single day. The evidence is surrounding us, even as they have admitted, as we've seen. The Bible is also completely trustworthy when it comes to how you can obtain the salvation of your soul. What God has revealed is the truth. And so the first question you must ask yourself is, do I believe it? And if the answer is yes, then the second question is, have I done it? This evening, if you have to answer either of those questions with a no, then we're prepared to help you in your obedience to the point that you can answer yes. God is reliable. He is trustworthy. His word has been shown over and over to be absolutely reliable. And so tonight, if you need the salvation that He offers in the way that He has revealed in the Scriptures, and we can help you with that, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing this song.